There are moments in history when the weight of an entire civilization rests on a single pair of shoulders. Not metaphorically, literally. When the institutions that held a world together have one by one given way, when the diplomats have failed and the philosophers have retreated inward and the economists have run out of answers, and what remains is a single man standing in the wreckage, deciding whether to attempt the impossible. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century was such a moment, and the man who answered it was a peasant's son from the Danube frontier who had spent his entire life as a soldier and who, at 55 years old, inherited an empire fractured into 3 separate pieces and spent the next 5 years putting it back together. His name was Lucius Domitius Aurelianus. History would call him the restorer of the world. He earned that title in a way that very few men in the long catalogue of Roman emperors ever earned anything. The Rome that Aurelian inherited in the year 270 was almost unrecognisable from the Rome that Edward Gibbon would later describe with such luminous admiration. The Rome of the Antonine emperors, of Trajan and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. When the empire stretched from the moors of Scotland to the banks of the Euphrates, from the cold forests of the Rhine to the burning sands of the Sahara, that empire had been the most successful political project the Western world had ever produced. A single currency moved goods from the tin mines of Britain to the spice markets of Syria. A single legal system administered justice from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Persia. A road network of such extraordinary quality that significant sections of it remained in daily use well into the medieval period connected every provincial capital to Rome itself. Gibbon, reflecting on the Antonine period from the comfortable vantage of the 18th century, called it the age in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Whatever argument historians may have with that sweeping verdict, it captures something genuinely true about the impression that era makes on anyone who studies it. It was, by almost any measure available to the ancient world, a remarkable achievement. Then Marcus Aurelius died in 180, and the long deterioration began, not as a sudden catastrophic break, not as a single decisive moment of collapse, but as a grinding, accelerating erosion, a sequence of mutually reinforcing catastrophes that historians have given the deceptively tidy name the crisis of the 3rd century. The period runs roughly from 235 to 284, and within those 5 decades, the Roman state experienced pressures that compounded upon each other with a savage and relentless logic. The first was external. The Germanic peoples on the Rhine-Danube frontier, the Goths, the Alemanni, the Franks, the Vandals, were not the same opponents that Julius Caesar or Augustus had faced. They had spent 2 centuries watching Rome. They had absorbed Roman military organization, Roman tactics, Roman equipment. Some had served in Roman armies and carried that knowledge home. They had consolidated from loose tribal confederacies into larger, more politically coherent groupings that could sustain campaigns of real strategic depth. On the eastern frontier, the old Parthian Empire, Rome's traditional rival, the enemy the legions had fought to an exhausting draw for 300 years, had been swept away in 224 by a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, who were more aggressive, better organized, and burning with an ideological conviction that the Parthians had never possessed. The Sassanids believed themselves the heirs of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire that Alexander the Great had conquered, and they prosecuted that belief against Rome with a military seriousness that made them the most dangerous single external enemy the empire had faced since Hannibal crossed the Alps. The second catastrophe was internal. The army, which had always been the empire's strength, had become its most corrosive weakness. By the 3rd century, the legal principle that an emperor required the Senate's approval and some form of popular legitimacy had effectively ceased to function. An emperor was whomever the army proclaimed, and the army's proclamations followed the logic of immediate advantage rather than institutional loyalty. Between 235 and 284, approximately 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Most of them died violently, most often killed by the very soldiers who had elevated them. The average reign during the worst years barely exceeded 2 years, and many lasted only months. The third catastrophe was economic. The denarius, the silver coin that had been the engine of Mediterranean commerce for centuries, had been systematically debased by emperor after emperor, desperate to extract more coinage from a fixed silver supply. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was functionally a bronze coin with a silver wash that rubbed off quickly. And the consequences: inflation, the collapse of long-distance trade, the retreat of entire regional economies back toward barter, were devastating. The fourth catastrophe was biological, the plague of Cyprian, striking in the 240s and persisting episodically into the 260s, killed on a scale that contemporary writers described with a horror that modern scholarship has gradually come to take seriously. Cities emptied, farms went unworked. The army struggled to recruit from an already exhausted population. Each catastrophe fed the others in a cycle that by 270 had brought the greatest empire in Western history to a condition that its own citizens, looking around at the wreckage of what had once seemed permanent, had largely concluded was terminal. They were wrong, but it would take an extraordinary man to prove it. To truly feel the weight of what Aurelian walked into, you need to sit inside the crisis for a moment, rather than simply observe it from a distance. The structural analysis, external pressure, military instability, economic debasement, epidemic mortality, gives you the architecture of collapse. But architecture does not bleed. The 3rd century bled. It bled in ways that left marks on the landscape, on the coinage, on the documentary record, and on the collective memory of a civilization that had spent 500 years telling itself it was invincible, and was now being forced to reckon with the possibility that invincibility had simply run out. The Germanic peoples pressing against the Rhine-Danube frontier were the most visible and immediate face of that reckoning. They were not, it bears repeating, the barbarians of Roman imagination, the howling, disorganized masses that Roman triumphal propaganda had always depicted being trampled beneath the hooves of Roman cavalry. The Goths who crossed the Danube in the 250s and 260s were something considerably more unsettling. They came in organized formations, with supply discipline, with tactical awareness of Roman weaknesses, and with the patience of peoples who had been calculating their moment for generations. They sacked Thessaloniki. They raided deep into Asia Minor. In 267 or 268, a Gothic force penetrated all the way to Athens, an act of cultural violation so shocking to the Greek-speaking world that the Athenian historian Dexippus organized a citizen militia to resist them. A detail that feels almost novelistic until you remember it is documented fact. The Sassanid Persians on the eastern frontier were a different and in some ways more terrifying kind of threat. Where the Germanic peoples were opportunistic raiders who exploited Roman weakness, the Sassanids were a state actor with imperial ambitions and the institutional capacity to pursue them. Their founder, Ardashir, he had overthrown the Parthians in 224 and immediately began pressing westward into Roman territory. His son Shapur I took the project further. With a military sophistication and a propaganda apparatus that Rome had never encountered from an eastern enemy, Shapur defeated 3 Roman emperors in the field. 3. Gordian III was killed in battle in 244. Philip the Arab purchased peace with a humiliating tribute. And then, in 260, came the event that scarred the Roman psyche more deeply than anything since the Teutoburg forest. The Emperor Valerian, commanding a Roman army in Syria, was captured in battle by Shapur and led away in chains. An emperor of Rome, a prisoner of Persia, Shapur commemorated the moment in stone, carving enormous relief sculptures at Naksha Rustam near Persepolis showing Valerian kneeling before the mounted Persian king. Those carvings are still there. They remain one of the most eloquent statements in the archaeological record of what the 3rd century actually felt like from the outside looking in. The internal political collapse that paralleled these external pressures had its own particular horror. A horror less dramatic than a captured emperor, but more corrosive in its daily operation. The soldier emperors of the crisis period were not, for the most part, incompetent men. Many of them were capable commanders who, under more stable circumstances, might have governed effectively. The problem was structural. An emperor who owed his throne to the army lived and died by the army's continuing satisfaction, which meant that every military decision was simultaneously a political calculation. And every political calculation was shadowed by the knowledge that a disappointed or unpaid or simply bored unit could proclaim a new emperor before nightfall. This produced a particular kind of imperial paralysis. Long-term policy required the confidence that you would still be in power long enough for the policy to bear fruit. And that confidence was precisely what the 3rd century denied. The circular logic was exquisite and terrible. The army made emperors, which meant emperors needed armies, which meant armies needed to be paid and supplied and kept victorious, which meant campaigns that stripped frontier defences, which created the instability that made new emperors necessary. 50 men in 50 years, most killed by their own soldiers. The mathematics of political failure on a civilizational scale, the economic catastrophe that ran underneath all of this deserves to be understood not as an abstraction but as a daily reality felt in every marketplace and every household across the empire. When the denarius was sound, a farmer in North Africa selling grain, a potter in Gaul selling amphorae, a soldier on the Danube spending his pay, all of them operated within a system of reliable exchange that made planning possible, that allowed savings to hold their value, that made the future calculable in ways that daily life requires. When the denarius became bronze, washed in silver that wore off within months of minting, all of that dissolved. Prices became unpredictable. Contracts specified payment in kind rather than coin because coin could not be trusted. Tax collectors demanded grain and oil and animals because the government itself no longer fully trusted the money it issued. The papyri from Roman Egypt, the most detailed documentary record of provincial life the ancient world has left us, preserve this reality in the specific, unglamorous detail that large historical narratives tend to skip over. A village council writing to report that their tax collector has fled and no replacement has arrived. A merchant carefully specifying that a sale price is to be paid in gold of a particular weight and fineness rather than in denarii of uncertain content. A soldier writing home asking whether the olive harvest was good. A question that meant something different in a world where the harvest might be worth more than his pay. The crisis of the 3rd century was experienced from the inside not as a geopolitical drama but as the slow, grinding discovery that the things you had been able to count on could no longer be counted on. That was the world Aurelian inherited. That was the world he set out to fix. By the early 260s, the accumulated pressures of the crisis had produced an outcome that would have seemed not merely unlikely, but cosmically impossible to any observer of the Antonine period. The Roman Empire, the single greatest political achievement of the ancient Western world, the state that had absorbed Carthage and Greece and Egypt and Gaul and Britain and Syria into a coherent administrative unity held together by law and road and currency and the quiet, pervasive confidence of shared civilization, had fractured into 3 separate entities, not metaphorically fractured, not administratively strained, but literally divided into 3 distinct political units, each with its own emperor, its own army, its own coinage, its own claim to legitimacy, and its own vision of what the Roman future ought to look like. The centre had not merely weakened, it had, for all practical purposes, ceased to be the centre of anything. What remained of the original empire controlled the Balkans, Italy, and parts of North Africa, squeezed between a breakaway western state and an expanding eastern rival, fighting for survival on multiple fronts simultaneously, while its economy continued to dissolve beneath it. Rome, the city that had given its name to everything, was now merely the symbolic capital of the weakest of the three successor arrangements. The empire that the coins still proclaimed eternal was visibly, measurably, undeniably mortal. The Western breakaway, the entity modern historians call the Gallic Empire, had its origins in a moment of brutal practical logic in the year 260. A general named Postumus, commanding the Rhine frontier armies, killed the son of the Emperor Gallienus, who had been left in nominal charge of the western provinces, and had himself proclaimed emperor by the Rhine legions. The crucial thing to understand about Postumus is that he was not, in any conventional sense, a revolutionary. He did not march on Rome. He did not claim to be the legitimate emperor of the entire empire. He did not dream of replacing Gallienus as master of the Roman world. What he wanted, what the soldiers who elevated him wanted, was a government capable of actually defending the western provinces from the Germanic raids that the distracted central government had demonstrably failed to prevent. Postumus provided that government with a competence that deserves genuine respect. He maintained the Rhine frontier effectively throughout his reign, keeping the worst of the raiding at manageable levels. His court at Augusta Treverorum, the city we now call Trier in Germany, maintained the full apparatus of Roman imperial governance: a senate, consuls, a mint, a functioning administration. His coin, notably, carried a higher silver content than the debased denarii pouring from the central imperial mints, a fact that speaks volumes about the fiscal discipline his government managed to maintain. The Gallic Empire was not a rebellion against Rome. It was a regional version of Rome, assembled from the pieces the central government had abandoned, doing the job the central government had stopped doing. It would survive for over a decade, passing through 3 rulers after Postumus was murdered by his own troops in 269, characteristically of the era. He had refused to allow them to sack a city they had captured, a display of principled discipline that cost him his life. The Eastern breakaway was something altogether more ambitious, and its central figure was one of the most extraordinary individuals the ancient world produced. The kingdom of Palmyra was a desert trading city in what is now Syria, sitting at the precise centre of the most valuable caravan route in the ancient world, the road connecting the Mediterranean coast to the Euphrates crossing and thence to Mesopotamia, Persia, and the eastern trade networks that funneled silk and spice and luxury goods from India and China into the insatiable markets of the Roman Mediterranean. Palmyra had grown rich beyond easy description on the fees and services generated by that trade, and its wealth was expressed in the remarkable colonnaded city whose ruins still rise from the Syrian desert in the 21st century. Rose-gold limestone columns catching the desert light in a silhouette that has become one of the iconic images of the ancient world. The city's ruling class was cosmopolitan in the specific way that a place at the intersection of Roman, Aramaic, and Persian cultural worlds tends to produce. Roman citizens who held Roman offices, heirs to a Semitic cultural tradition thousands of years old, and continuous commercial partners of the Persian East. Zenobia, who assumed the regency of Palmyra after her husband Odenathus was murdered in 268, was a product of that cosmopolitan world in every dimension of her remarkable personality. She spoke Egyptian, Aramaic, Greek, and reportedly Latin. Her court attracted philosophers and scholars from across the eastern Mediterranean, including the Neoplatonist Longinus, one of the finest minds of the 3rd century, who served as her intellectual advisor and companion. She modelled herself consciously on the great Hellenistic queens, on Cleopatra and the queens of the Seleucid dynasty, and she pursued their ambitions with a strategic clarity that unsettled everyone who underestimated her, which was almost everyone who encountered her for the first time. Between 269 and 271, Zenobia's armies swept through Egypt, through Syria, through much of Asia Minor, claiming Roman imperial titles for her young son Vaballathus and establishing what was in all but formal declaration an independent Eastern empire. Egypt was the most economically critical province in the Roman world. Its grain fed much of the Mediterranean. Its tax revenues constituted a substantial fraction of the imperial budget, and its loss to Palmyrene control was a wound the central government could not long survive. Asia Minor, the most heavily urbanized and economically productive region outside Italy itself, followed. The central Roman government, caught between the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene expansion in the east, controlling only the Balkans and a strip of territory between the two rival powers, was in the position of a man watching his house burn from both ends simultaneously, while standing in the diminishing middle, wondering which direction to run. Into this situation, in the year 270, stepped Aurelian. The question was not whether the situation was desperate. Everyone agreed it was desperate. The question was whether one man, given 5 years and a damaged army and a broken economy, could actually reverse it. The answer, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be yes. The men who saved the Roman Empire in the 3rd century were almost never the men who looked the part. They were not the polished aristocrats of the senatorial class, not the silver-tongued orators who had navigated the cursus honorum from quaestor to praetor to consul with the practised ease of men born into the assumption of authority. They were men like Aurelian, men from the provinces, from the frontier, from the hard, grinding world of military service where advancement came not through the right family connections, but through the demonstrated ability to keep soldiers alive and enemies dead. The biography of Lucius Domitius Aurelianus before his accession to power is frustratingly thin in the sources, as is true of most soldier emperors of the crisis period. Men who rose from obscurity through military performance left fewer documentary traces than men who rose through the aristocratic networks that generated correspondence, legal records, and the detailed social documentation that ancient historians relied upon. What survives is fragmentary, occasionally invented, and requires the kind of careful reading that historians of the 3rd century have learned to apply to almost everything the era left behind. But the fragments, read properly, assemble into a portrait of remarkable coherence and force. He was born around 214 or 215, probably in the region of Moesia or Dacia along the Danube frontier, the provinces that modern Bulgaria and Romania now occupy. His father was, by the available accounts, either a tenant farmer or a small freeholder, a man of modest means in a region that was itself modest, a frontier zone more accustomed to military camps and border anxieties than to the comfortable civic life of the more settled interior provinces. There is a tradition preserved in the Historia Augusta that his mother served as a priestess of Sol Invictus, the sun god, whose cult would become so central to his later reign, a detail that may be accurate family history or may be pious legend constructed after the fact to connect the emperor to his divine patron with a biographical neatness that Roman historical tradition always found appealing. The Historia Augusta is a source that demands constant vigilance. It invents speeches, fabricates document, confuses chronology, and decorates its subjects with a kind of biographical convenience that reveals more about the tradition's preferences than about the historical reality. Where it can be corroborated, it is sometimes reliable. Where it cannot, it requires skepticism rather than simple dismissal. On Aurelian specifically, the broad outlines it provides are consistent enough with what other sources and the physical evidence confirm that the portrait, while not trustworthy in its details, is probably not wholly invented in its essentials. He entered the army young, which for a man of his background and his era was the obvious move. The Roman military was one of the very few institutions in the ancient world that offered genuine social mobility to men without wealth or family connections, and the Danube frontier provinces supplied a disproportionate share of the empire's best soldiers, precisely because they were places where the military was not merely a career option, but a defining feature of daily life. He rose through the ranks on the basis of military ability that evidently made an impression on those above him at every stage of his career. The sources are consistent on his physical qualities: tall, powerfully built, capable of extraordinary endurance in conditions that exhausted other men, and possessed of a personal authority that combined absolute command presence with an austere simplicity in his own habits that his troops found genuine rather than performed. He did not live better than his men when the campaign allowed otherwise. He did not ask of them anything he had not demonstrated he could do himself. These qualities are not always found together in ambitious men, and their combination in Aurelian appears to have generated the specific kind of loyalty that cannot be manufactured by ceremony or reward alone. The loyalty of men who have watched someone earn what he claims. His specialization was cavalry, which in the evolving military landscape of the 3rd century was increasingly central to Roman tactical effectiveness. The Sassanid Persians and the Gothic confederacies both fielded cavalry of a quality that traditional Roman heavy infantry struggled to meet on equal terms, and the Roman military response across the crisis decades was to develop its own heavy cavalry arm. The cataphracts, armoured horsemen on armoured horses capable of the shock action that the new enemies could deliver, alongside lighter Dalmatian and Moorish horse for screening and pursuit. Aurelian commanded and developed within this evolving cavalry tradition, and the tactical fingerprints of a cavalry mind are visible in every major campaign he subsequently conducted as emperor: the aggressive tempo, the reliance on speed to deny enemies time to consolidate, the preference for decision-forcing action over the grinding attritional engagements that the older legionary tradition favoured. He was present at the murder of Gallienus in 268 and at the elevation of Claudius II, the emperor who won the significant victory over the Goths at the Battle of Naissus that earned him the epithet Gothicus and briefly made it seem as though the worst of the crisis might be ending. Claudius died of plague in 270. The same plague that had been killing Romans in waves for 3 decades showed no deference to imperial office, and the army on the Danube elevated Aurelian in his place. He was approximately 55 years old. The number is worth sitting with for a moment. 55 in the 3rd century. For a man who had spent his entire adult life on the most contested and physically demanding frontier in the empire, was not the vigorous middle age that modern medicine might suggest. It was a substantial age, carrying the accumulated damage of decades of campaigning in the body of a man who had never had reason to spare himself. And yet what followed over the next 5 years was a demonstration of physical and intellectual energy that would have been remarkable in a man of 30. History occasionally produces this particular irony: the right man arriving at the right moment, at an age when most men of his era were already dead, and finding within himself the resources for the defining effort of a lifetime, precisely when the hour demanded it most. Aurelian had been emperor for barely enough time to learn the administrative rhythms of his new position when the crisis arrived, that would define the opening of his reign and announce to the Roman world exactly what kind of emperor it had acquired: the Euthungi, a Germanic people associated with the broader Alemanni Confederation pressing against the upper Danube and Rhine frontier, invaded Italy in 270. The sentence requires a moment of genuine historical imagination to feel its full weight. Italy, not a frontier province, not a contested border zone where Roman and barbarian had been trading violence for generations. Italy itself, the heartland, the homeland, the place from which Rome had grown and to which every road in the empire ultimately led. The Italian peninsula had not been a military theatre in any meaningful sense for generations. It had no significant defensive infrastructure, no frontier legions positioned for rapid response, no network of fortified positions designed to absorb and channel an invading force. It was a civilian landscape of farms and cities and roads built on the assumption that the frontier armies would prevent enemies from ever getting this far. That assumption had now been catastrophically proven wrong, and the symbolic and psychological consequences of Germanic raiders moving through the Po Valley were as significant as the physical destruction they caused. Barbarians in Italy were not merely a military problem, they were a statement, crude, violent, and unmistakable about the condition of the Roman state. Aurelian moved against the Iuthungi with the characteristic speed that would define all his major operations. He caught their return column, laden with Italian plunder and Italian captives being herded northward toward the Danube crossing, and fought a series of sharp engagements that the sources record with the selective detail that ancient military history typically provides. The victories were real and significant, pushing the Iuthungi back and recovering substantial numbers of captives. But there was also, in this opening campaign, a moment of genuine crisis that the sources mention, with the understated brevity that in ancient historical writing almost always signals authentic embarrassment rather than rhetorical modesty. At Placentia, the city we now call Piacenza in northern Italy, Aurelian's force suffered a defeat. The details are obscure, the exact circumstances lost in the compression that the ancient accounts applied to reverses they found uncomfortable to dwell upon. What is clear is that it was the only significant battlefield defeat of Aurelian's entire military career. And what makes it historically interesting is not the defeat itself, but what followed it. A different commander, and the 3rd century had produced many, might have treated a defeat in Italy as a reason to consolidate, to pull back to a defensible position, to await reinforcement before resuming the pursuit. Aurelian did none of these things. He rallied his forces, reorganized his approach, and pursued the Iuthungi relentlessly until he caught them again at Fano on the Adriatic coast and destroyed their army with a thoroughness that reversed the narrative of Placentia completely. The capacity to absorb a setback without losing operational momentum, to be knocked back without being knocked down, is one of the rarest and most important qualities a military commander can possess, and Aurelian demonstrated it in the very first campaign of his reign, establishing a pattern of resilience that would characterize everything that followed. The Alemanni arrived before the dust of the Iuthungi campaign had fully settled, a second Germanic invasion of Italy within the space of a single year, striking through the Alpine passes into the Po Valley with a strength and speed that demonstrated how completely the old certainties about Italy's safety had collapsed. The Battle of Pavia in 271 was Aurelian's decisive answer, a Roman victory of sufficient completeness to drive the Alemanni back across the Alps and end. For the immediate term, the threat of further Germanic penetration into the Italian heartland, 2 invasions, 2 ultimate victories, 1 painful reversal overcome. It was an impressive opening sequence for a new reign, but Aurelian understood, with the strategic clarity that distinguished him from commanders who could win battles without grasping their larger context, that tactical victories over individual Germanic incursions were not a solution to the underlying problem. The underlying problem was structural. Italy had no defences worth the name, and as long as that remained true, every Germanic confederation with the ambition and the opportunity would make the calculation that Italy was worth raiding. The answer to that structural problem was not more legions. The empire did not have more legions to spare, and stationing significant forces permanently in Italy would strip the frontier defences that were already stretched dangerously thin. The answer was architecture. Stone and mortar and labour and engineering intelligence applied to the oldest solution to the problem of defence that human civilization had ever devised: a wall. The decision to build defensive walls around Rome itself was one of the most psychologically freighted choices of Aurelian's reign, because the city of Rome had not needed walls since the early Republic, when the Gauls had sacked it in 390 BCE. For 5 centuries, Rome had grown in the serene confidence that the legions on the distant frontiers were its walls, that the empire's defensive perimeter was so far from the city's streets that the question of local fortification simply did not arise. The Aurelian Wall, construction of which began in 271, was therefore not merely a military project, it was an acknowledgement, built in brick and concrete and standing nearly 8 meters high, that the world had fundamentally changed. The circuit ran for nearly 12 miles around the city, enclosing the 7 hills and the Transtiberum district across the Tiber within a continuous defensive perimeter studded with towers at intervals of roughly 30 meters, pierced by fortified gates at every major road junction, and designed with the practical engineering intelligence that Roman military construction had always brought to its projects. It was calculated to be defensible by a relatively small garrison equipped with artillery mounted on the towers and gates, because Rome's population of nearly 1 million people would have required far more soldiers than the empire could spare to man 12 miles of wall in the conventional manner. And Aurelian was too good an administrator to design a defensive system that required resources he did not have. The wall was not completed during his lifetime. His successors extended and refined it across the decades following his death. But it stands today, running through the neighborhoods of modern Rome in sections of remarkable preservation, rising behind apartment blocks and alongside parked cars with the serene indifference of something built well enough to simply outlast everything that has happened since. It is the most visible physical legacy of the crisis that nearly destroyed Rome, and of the man who refused to let it. The Aurelian Wall deserves more than a passing acknowledgement as a feat of engineering, because the scale and ambition of the project reveals something important about the man who ordered it, and the institutional capacity of the empire that built it, even in its damaged state. Roman construction was not simply a matter of issuing an order and watching it happen. It required surveyors to map the circuit, engineers to calculate the defensive geometry, architects to design the gate complexes and tower placements, supervisors to coordinate the labor forces, and the logistical infrastructure to supply the enormous quantities of brick and concrete and timber that 12 miles of continuous defensive wall demanded. All of this happened while Aurelian was simultaneously campaigning against Germanic invaders, managing the political transition of a new reign, and beginning to think through the strategic problems that awaited him on every other frontier of the empire. The wall was not built in a moment of calm reflection. It was built in the middle of an emergency, alongside an emergency, as both a practical response to immediate danger and a long-term investment in the city's security that would outlast the immediate crisis by centuries. That the project was conceived and initiated at all under those conditions says something significant about Aurelian's capacity to hold multiple strategic timelines in his mind simultaneously, to act on the urgent without losing sight of the important. The brick courses that Roman labourers laid in 271 are still there, embedded in the fabric of the modern city, carrying their testimony to that capacity in the mute and permanent language of good construction. The wall's engineering details are worth dwelling on precisely because they reveal the practical intelligence behind what could otherwise seem like a purely symbolic gesture. The circuit was designed around the existing topography of the city, incorporating earlier structures where possible, sections of the earlier Servian wall, aqueduct arches, and existing buildings were integrated into the new defensive line wherever the geometry allowed, reducing the labour required and making efficient use of what already existed. The towers projecting from the wall face were spaced at intervals calculated to allow artillery mounted on each tower to cover the ground in front of the adjacent towers on both sides, a geometric arrangement that eliminated dead ground, the areas directly beneath and beside a tower that a wall without projecting towers cannot cover. The gates were designed as fortified complexes with multiple barriers, portcullis, and flanking towers that turned each road entrance into a defended killing ground rather than a simple opening. The wall walk along the top of the circuit allowed defenders to move rapidly between threatened points without exposure to fire from outside. Every element of the design reflects the specific tactical knowledge of a military engineer thinking through the problem of how to defend a very long perimeter with a relatively small force, and solving it with the systematic intelligence that Roman military engineering had been developing and refining for centuries. Later emperors heightened the wall, added external ditches, and modified the gate complexes, but the fundamental logic of Aurelian's original design was sound enough that those modifications enhanced rather than replaced what he had created. While the wall's construction proceeded in Rome, Aurelian was simultaneously managing the strategic situation on the Danube frontier, a front that could never be entirely neglected regardless of what was happening elsewhere, because the Gothic pressure on the lower Danube was constant and the consequences of allowing it to go unanswered were severe. The Tervingi and the Greuthungi, the two main Gothic groupings pressing against the frontier in this period, were not the same force that Claudius II had defeated at the Battle of Naissus. That battle had broken one Gothic coalition, but Gothic pressure on the frontier was not a single coalition that could be permanently defeated in a single engagement. It was a sustained demographic reality. Large populations of mobile peoples pressing against a fixed frontier, probing for weakness, exploiting every moment of Roman political distraction, and rebuilding after defeats with a resilience that reflected the fundamental pressure of peoples who needed land and resources that lay on the Roman side of the river. Aurelian's Danubian campaigns of 270 and 271, conducted more or less simultaneously with the Italian defence against the Euthungi and Alemanni, produced a series of victories that stabilised the lower Danube sufficiently for his purposes. Not a permanent solution, but a temporary suppression of the most urgent threat that bought him the operational freedom to look eastward. The simultaneous management of two active military theatres on opposite ends of the empire, conducted by a man who had been emperor for barely a year, was itself a demonstration of the organisational intelligence that made Aurelian extraordinary rather than merely capable. The decision to abandon Dacia, however, was the most consequential and the most debated strategic choice of this period of Aurelian's reign. Trajan had conquered the province in the early 2nd century. The great campaigns commemorated in the spiral reliefs of Trajan's column in Rome, and the empire had held it with considerable effort for a century and a half. Dacia sat north of the Danube, a salient of Roman territory projecting into the Germanic and Gothic world. Separated from the main body of the empire by the river, expensive to supply and reinforce, and increasingly difficult to hold against Gothic pressure from multiple directions, its gold and silver mines had been among its primary values to Rome. But by the early 270s, those resources had to be weighed against the military cost of garrisoning a province that required constant defence across an extended and difficult frontier. Aurelian made the calculation that the cost exceeded the benefit, and he organised a systematic withdrawal, relocating military garrisons and as much of the civilian population as could be moved to new settlements south of the Danube in Moesia, establishing them in a province that official documents called Dacia Aureliana, to preserve the institutional continuity of the provincial name while acknowledging the geographic reality of the change. The withdrawal was presented in official Roman ideology not as a retreat, but as a strategic consolidation. The emperor was not abandoning Roman territory, but rationalizing the frontier to a more defensible line. A river is a better frontier than an exposed salient of territory beyond the river, and the Danube, once Dacia was relinquished, became exactly the clean defensive boundary that the previous arrangement had never provided. The decision demonstrated the strategic pragmatism that ran through everything Aurelian did, the willingness to sacrifice what could not be effectively defended in order to concentrate resources on what could, without the ideological rigidity that would have insisted on holding Dacia for its symbolic value regardless of its strategic cost. The Danube was secure, the wall was rising, Aurelian turned east. There are cities in history whose greatness was so completely a product of their geographic position that when that position lost its value, the cities themselves ceased to matter almost overnight. And then there are cities whose greatness transcended geography, whose wealth and culture and accumulated intellectual energy made them something more than the trade routes that had initially generated their prosperity. Palmyra was both simultaneously a city whose existence depended entirely on its location at the precise centre of the most valuable caravan route in the ancient world, and yet a city that had transformed that commercial foundation into something genuinely extraordinary. A civilization in miniature at the intersection of three of the great cultural traditions of antiquity. It sat in the Syrian desert roughly 240 kilometres northeast of Damascus, at an oasis whose water made it the only viable stopping point for caravans crossing the vast emptiness between the Mediterranean coast and the Euphrates. Every merchant moving silk from China, spice from India, or luxury goods from Persia to the markets of the Roman Mediterranean passed through Palmyra, every shipment moving in the opposite direction. Roman glass, wine, olive oil, metalwork, passed through it going the other way. The city took a percentage of all of it, in fees and services and the commercial activity that a major transit hub generates. And over the course of 2 centuries, it converted that percentage into one of the most spectacular urban environments in the ancient world. The physical city that Zenobia inherited and ruled was an architectural statement of breathtaking ambition. The Great Colonnade, a colonnaded street running for over a mile through the heart of the city, was flanked by hundreds of columns topped with brackets that had once held statues of the city's leading families. Merchants and officials and civic benefactors commemorated in stone at eye height, where every passerby could see and recognize them. It was a 3-dimensional public record of Palmyrene social life, carved in the distinctive rose-gold limestone that the Syrian desert provides, and it created an urban experience unlike anything else in the Roman world. Not the marble grandeur of Rome or the Greek monumentality of Athens or Ephesus, but something distinctly Palmyrene, a fusion of Roman civic form with Semitic decorative tradition and Persian spatial sensibility. The great Temple of Bel, dedicated to the supreme deity of the Palmyrene pantheon, combined Greek temple architecture with the enclosed courtyard tradition of Near Eastern religious practice in a synthesis that expressed perfectly the cosmopolitan character of the city it served. The ruins of these structures still rise from the Syrian desert in the 21st century, damaged by the violence that swept through the region in recent years but not destroyed. The limestone is too massive, the construction too solid, for even deliberate destruction to erase entirely. They stand as testimony to what the ancient world could build when it had the resources and the will, and as testimony to what was lost when Aurelian's punitive expedition reduced the living city to a shadow of itself. Zenobia herself requires a portrait that does justice to her genuine complexity, without falling into either the idealization that ancient and later writers were sometimes prone to apply to powerful women they found fascinating, or the dismissiveness that the same tradition occasionally deployed when the fascination curdled into anxiety. She was the daughter of a Palmyrene aristocratic family, educated in the cosmopolitan tradition that Palmyra's position at the intersection of 3 cultural worlds made possible, and she had married Odenathus, the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman world in the 260s, as a political alliance that proved to be something considerably more than merely political. Odenathus was a brilliant operator who had navigated the extraordinary complexity of the post-Valerian Eastern situation with a skill that deserves its own recognition, presenting himself to Rome as a loyal ally, providing essential frontier defence, to the Palmyrene elite as their champion against both Roman overreach and Persian aggression, and to the broader Syrian population as a ruler whose military effectiveness justified his authority. After Valerian's capture by Shapur in 260, Odenathus had essentially saved the eastern frontier by his own efforts, pursuing the victorious Persian army back across the Euphrates and preventing the collapse that the Roman loss of its emperor might otherwise have produced. Rome rewarded him with titles and recognition. He rewarded Rome with continued loyalty, up to a point when Odenathus was murdered in 268, by whom and for what reasons the sources do not agree, with Zenobia herself appearing in some accounts as a suspect before being cleared in others. Zenobia assumed the regency for their young son Vabalithus, and revealed the full scope of the ambition she had apparently been developing throughout her years as consort. She spoke Egyptian, Aramaic, Greek, and reportedly Latin. She could ride with her cavalry and march on foot alongside her infantry in the manner of the Hellenistic queens, who were her explicit political models. The philosopher Longinus, one of the most formidable intellects of the 3rd century, the author of the treatise On the Sublime, that remains a foundational text of literary criticism, served as her chief advisor and the intellectual centre of a court that attracted scholars, rhetoricians, and philosophers from across the Eastern Mediterranean. This was not a provincial strongman's court decorating itself with borrowed cultural prestige. It was a genuinely sophisticated intellectual environment, one in which the question of Palmyra's relationship to Rome and to the broader currents of late antique philosophy and culture was being debated and developed at the highest level available in the 3rd century world. Zenobia's expansion into Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor between 269 and 271 was not the opportunistic raiding of a border chieftain exploiting Roman weakness. It was the deliberate construction of an alternative Eastern empire, pursued with strategic consistency and political intelligence across 3 years of careful consolidation. She claimed Roman imperial titles for Vaballathus and eventually for herself. She organized a court and military establishment of genuinely imperial ambitions, and she chose, when Aurelian marched east to confront her, to fight rather than negotiate, a choice that Longinus apparently encouraged. And that would cost him his life and her everything she had built. But it was, given what she was and what she had created, the choice that was true to herself. Palmyra had been extraordinary. Its queen had been extraordinary. Aurelian was about to demonstrate that extraordinary was not enough. The speed with which Aurelian moved his army from the Danube to Asia Minor in 272 was itself a military statement. In the politics of the 3rd century, speed was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a psychological weapon, a demonstration that the central Roman government possessed a operational energy that its rivals and enemies had come to doubt. Every day that passed between a threat emerging and a Roman army appearing in response was a day that the threat had time to consolidate, to recruit allies, to fortify positions, and to convince wavering populations that the future lay with the new power rather than the old one. Aurelian understood this with the instinct of a man who had spent his career in the cavalry, where tempo was everything and hesitation was fatal. He had dealt with the Euthungi, the Alemanni, and the immediate Danubian pressure. He had begun the construction of Rome's walls. He had made the strategic decision to withdraw from Dacia and consolidate the Danube line. Now he turned east with an army that had been tested and bloodied and was following a commander it had already seen perform the impossible once. The march through Asia Minor that followed was, in military terms, almost anticlimactic. City after city submitted as Aurelian advanced, not primarily out of fear, though fear was certainly present, but out of the pragmatic calculation that Greek-speaking, commercially sophisticated urban populations have always made when armies appear on their doorstep. The cities of Asia Minor had prospered under Roman administration. They had prospered less thoroughly under Palmyrene control, which had disrupted the trade networks and administrative arrangements they depended on. A Roman emperor marching west to east with a competent army and a demonstrated willingness to treat submitting populations with consideration was, by the standards of the 3rd century, a comparatively attractive option. The decisive military engagement of the Eastern campaign came at Imae, near Antioch in Syria, and then was confirmed at Emesa, the city the modern world calls Homs, in a battle whose tactical design reveals the full sophistication of Aurelian's military thinking. The Palmyrene army's primary strength lay in its heavy-armoured cavalry, the cataphracts, horsemen encased in articulated armour of iron or bronze scales, mounted on horses similarly protected, virtually impervious to arrows and devastating in the shock of a direct charge. They were the most formidable cavalry force in the Eastern Mediterranean world, and they had been the instrument of Palmyra's military expansion across Egypt and Asia Minor. They were also, and this was the vulnerability that Aurelian had identified and intended to exploit, slow and rapidly exhausted by sustained effort. The weight of their armour made them powerful over short distances and nearly unstoppable in a direct charge. But it also meant that they could not sustain pursuit, could not easily recover from missed charges, and became increasingly ineffective as their horses tired under the burden of carrying armoured men in armoured barding across extended engagements. Aurelian designed his battle around this vulnerability with a tactical elegance that deserves recognition as one of the better pieces of battlefield planning the 3rd century produced. His cavalry feigned retreat, convincingly enough to draw the Palmyrene cataphracts into pursuit, which the heavy horsemen did, with the confidence of a force that had consistently dominated every cavalry engagement it had previously fought. When the cataphracts had been pursuing long enough that their horses were blown and the riders themselves exhausted by the weight and heat of their armour, the Roman cavalry turned and engaged them. An armoured cavalry force that cannot manoeuvre is functionally equivalent to armoured infantry caught in the open, and the result was decisive. The Palmyrene infantry, robbed of its cavalry support and facing a Roman infantry force that was now free to engage on favourable terms, collapsed in the subsequent fighting. Antioch opened its gates. Emesa fell. And then Aurelian's army advanced into the Syrian desert toward Palmyra itself, following the caravan road that merchants had travelled for centuries, moving through a landscape of extraordinary bleakness and beauty toward the oasis city, whose rose-gold columns had been rising from the desert for 300 years. Palmyra had walls sufficient to make a direct assault costly, and its wealth gave it the resources to sustain a siege longer than many cities could have managed. But Aurelian understood that Palmyra's power was fundamentally commercial and political rather than purely military. The city existed because of the trade routes it controlled, and a Roman army sitting across those routes was a more effective weapon than any artillery the empire could bring to bear against its walls. Cut off from the caravans, from the eastern trade that was the source of everything, Palmyra's political coalition began to dissolve with a speed that reflected how completely the city's authority had rested on the continued flow of wealth that Roman military dominance could interrupt at will. Zenobia made the decision to flee eastward toward the Euphrates, seeking the military assistance of the Sassanid Persians whose support might have transformed the entire strategic equation. She was captured at the river crossing and brought back to face the man she had challenged for control of the eastern half of the Roman world. What happened to Zenobia after her capture is one of those historical questions where the sources diverge in ways that cannot be definitively resolved, and where the most satisfying answer is also the least certain. Some accounts say she died during the journey to Rome, either from illness or by her own deliberate choice, a death that would have fit the Hellenistic queen model she had consciously inhabited throughout her reign. Others, and these are the accounts that later tradition found more comfortable to dwell on, say she was displayed in Aurelian's triumph in Rome in 274, walking in golden chains so heavy she could barely carry them, and was then released to live in comfortable retirement near Tivoli, where she married a Roman senator and spent her remaining years hosting philosophical conversations in a villa by the river. Longinus, whose advice to resist rather than negotiate had helped bring Palmyra to this point, was executed, a fate that his ancient admirers recorded with the particular sadness that the death of an exceptional mind in the service of a losing cause tends to generate in those who appreciate what was lost. Palmyra itself was initially spared and garrisoned. Then, when a subsequent revolt broke out while Aurelian was dealing with the western situation, the city was sacked with a thoroughness from which it never recovered, the ruins visible in Syria today, damaged further by 21st century violence, but not erased, are the ruins of Palmyra's greatness before Aurelian. Not after. What came after was a shadow. The desert had its city back, and the city was empty of everything that had made it matter. Aurelian returned from the east, having accomplished something that no informed observer of the Roman world in 270 would have predicted as possible in so short a time. The Palmyrene Empire, which had controlled Egypt and Syria and much of Asia Minor barely 2 years earlier, was gone. The eastern provinces were back under central Roman authority. The most economically critical region of the empire, the grain fields of Egypt, the commercial cities of Asia Minor, the eastern frontier zone that stood between Rome and the always threatening Persian kingdom, had been recovered and secured. It was an extraordinary achievement, and Aurelian could have been forgiven for pausing, for consolidating, for allowing the army and the administration time to absorb what had just happened before turning to the next problem. He did not pause. The Western problem was waiting, had been waiting throughout the entire Eastern campaign, and the logic that had made dealing with Palmyra first the correct strategic choice now operated in reverse. The Gallic Empire, that decade-old arrangement by which the Western provinces had organised their own defence and their own governance under their own emperors, remained in existence. The Roman world was still divided. The title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, that was beginning to appear on Aurelian's coins would be meaningless if half the world remained unrestored. He turned west. The Gallic Empire that Aurelian was moving to dissolve had, over its decade of existence, developed a character and a self-understanding that made it something more interesting than a simple act of provincial rebellion. Postumus, its founder, had been murdered by his own troops in 269, in the characteristically 3rd century fashion of dying for a principled decision, having refused to allow his soldiers to sack a city they had just captured, a display of disciplinary integrity that cost him everything. His immediate successors were less distinguished figures navigating the increasingly difficult politics of a state that had been created as an emergency response and was finding it harder to justify its continued separate existence as the emergency that had created it began to recede. The last of them, Gaius Pius Esuvius Tetricus, had been the governor of Aquitaine before his elevation to the Gallic throne in 271, a man of the administrative senatorial type rather than the military type, more comfortable with the procedural rhythms of provincial governance than with the demands of military command, in an era when military command was the primary qualification for imperial survival. He wore the purple with what the sources suggest was genuine reluctance. A man who had been placed by circumstance into a role that his temperament and training had not prepared him for, doing his best in conditions that would have tested far more naturally suited men. The Gallic Empire's military establishment was not negligible. It had maintained the Rhine frontier effectively throughout its existence, which had been its entire reason for being, and the legions that served it were experienced frontier troops who had been fighting Germanic incursions for years. But the political cohesion that holds a military force together in a genuinely contested engagement was more fragile than the force's professional competence suggested. The Gallic Empire's soldiers had been fighting to defend the western provinces against external enemies, fighting a civil war against the central Roman emperor, a man who had just defeated Zenobia of Palmyra and reunified the entire eastern half of the empire. Was a different proposition entirely, one that required a conviction in the justice and viability of the Gallic cause that was increasingly difficult to sustain as Aurelian's army moved westward through Gaul. Some sources suggest that Tetricus himself, aware of the military and political reality confronting him, entered into private communication with Aurelian before the final engagement, the two men reaching a personal understanding about the terms on which the Gallic Empire would end, and on which Tetricus himself would be treated afterward. Whether this account is accurate history or a later construction designed to explain the suspicious speed with which Gallic resistance collapsed at the decisive engagement cannot be determined with certainty from the sources available. What can be determined is that Tetricus survived, was treated with notable generosity, and was subsequently appointed to a civilian administrative position in Italy, a career outcome that is difficult to explain entirely by Roman clemency if he had not made himself useful to Aurelian in some way before the battle. The decisive engagement came at the Campus Catalanicus, the plain near the city that would later be known as Chalons and Champagne in northeastern Gaul, the same ground where Attila the Hun would meet his decisive defeat nearly 2 centuries later, as though the landscape itself had a preference for civilizational turning points. The battle ended with the collapse of Gallic resistance and the surrender of Tetricus with a speed that the sources find difficult to explain by military factors alone, which is what gives the betrayal story its persistent appeal even in the absence of definitive confirmation. Whether Tetricus betrayed his own army's dispositions, or whether the Gallic forces simply lacked the will to sustain a serious engagement against a Roman emperor who had just unified the entire eastern Mediterranean, the result was the same. The Gallic Empire, which had maintained its separate existence for 14 years across the reigns of 4 emperors, dissolved in a single afternoon on a Gallic plain. The western provinces returned to central Roman authority, and for the first time in over a decade, the Roman Empire was once again a single political entity under a single emperor. The centrifugal forces that had been tearing it apart, the regional divergences, the frontier armies acting as independent political units, the practical collapse of central authority across entire hemispheres of the empire's territory, had been reversed by one man in less than 5 years. Aurelian stood in the late afternoon of his western campaign as the ruler of an empire that was, by any reasonable measure, whole again. The coins would say it plainly, restituta orbis. The world had been restored. The man who had restored it turned his face toward Rome and the triumph that was waiting for him there. The Roman triumph was the most elaborate public ritual that Roman political culture had ever devised, and it had been elaborated across 5 centuries of practice into something that was simultaneously a military parade, a religious ceremony, a civic celebration, and a political communication of extraordinary density and sophistication. Its origins lay in the archaic period of the Republic, when a victorious general returning from war would process through the city from the Campus Martius to the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill, displaying his captives and his plunder to the Roman people as tangible evidence of Roman power and divine favour. By the imperial period it had become exclusively the emperor's prerogative, a ritual assertion that the military victories of the Roman state flowed through the person of the emperor and from the emperor to the people, and that the relationship between divine favour, imperial authority, and Roman military success was not merely conceptual but visible, processional, enacted in the streets of the city for every citizen to witness. The route of the triumphal procession moved through the heart of Rome, through the Circus Maximus, through the Forum Boarium, along the Via Sacra through the Roman Forum, past the major temples of the state religion, through neighbourhoods dense with the population of the most important city in the Western world. It was a spectacle on the largest scale the ancient world could produce, and the city's population, which had spent the crisis decades in various states of anxiety about what the political instability and the barbarian invasions of Italy meant for their future, turned out for it with an enthusiasm that the sources describe as genuine rather than ceremonial. The triumph of 274 was the first full triumph celebrated in Rome for years, and its significance went far beyond the military victories it commemorated. The political instability of the crisis period had not produced the kind of clear, empire-wide victories that the triumphal tradition required. Claudius II had won the Battle of Nasus, but had died before any triumph could be organised. The various soldier emperors of the preceding decades had fought their wars and died their violent deaths without the institutional continuity that a triumph demanded. The ritual required a living emperor, a completed victory, and a Rome secure enough to celebrate rather than merely endure. All 3 conditions had, for the first time in a generation, been simultaneously satisfied, and the city knew it. The procession that moved through Rome in 274 was a compressed summary of Aurelian's entire military career, translated into spectacle. Gothic prisoners from the Danubian campaigns walked alongside Palmyrene captives from the Eastern War. Alemanni warriors from the Italian defence marched in chains beside soldiers from the armies that had defended the Gallic breakaway. Exotic animals from the Eastern campaign, animals that the Roman urban population had never seen and would likely never see again, moved through streets that had not witnessed anything like this in living memory. The spoils of campaigns conducted across the full breadth of the empire, from the Rhine to the Euphrates, were displayed in a procession that turned the abstract political achievement of reunification into something the citizens of Rome could see and smell and hear in their own streets. Tetricus walked in the procession, the last emperor of the Gallic Empire, the man who had worn the purple in the West for 3 years, now walking through Rome as a captured enemy. The sources indicate that he had negotiated the terms of his appearance in advance, which speaks to both Aurelian's pragmatism and Tetricus's intelligence. He was not humiliated beyond what the ritual required, and he was not executed afterward. He was given the administrative appointment in Italy that the private understanding between the two men had apparently arranged. Zenobia's presence in the procession is attested by the sources, though the form it took remains uncertain. The golden chains so heavy she could barely walk are a detail that may be historical, or may be the kind of dramatic embellishment that the triumphal tradition attracted. What is certain is that both major figures of the campaign, the Queen of the East and the Emperor of the West, were present in Rome in 274 as testament to what Aurelian had accomplished, and that the Roman crowd understood perfectly well what it was witnessing. The world that had been broken was being declared whole. The man who had broken it back together was walking through the city he had saved. That detail, that Aurelian walked rather than rode in a chariot, is one of the most revealing things the sources preserve about him. The triumphal chariot was the traditional vehicle of the triumphator, raising him above the crowd in a visual assertion of the distance between the victorious emperor and the ordinary human beings through whose streets he processed. Aurelian chose to walk with his men. Whether this was a deliberate political communication, a personal preference rooted in the austerity that had characterized his entire public life, or both simultaneously, it produced an effect that the ancient sources noted as remarkable, and that modern readers can still recognize as characteristic of the man. An emperor who had earned his authority through demonstrated performance rather than inherited position, who had spent 5 years moving faster and working harder than any man around him, who had built the walls of Rome and reformed the currency and reunified the empire by the force of his will and his intelligence. That emperor did not need the height of a chariot to communicate his authority. The authority was evident in the fact that the procession existed at all, that Rome was whole, that the people lining the streets were cheering rather than fleeing. The title the Senate and the sources attached to him in this moment, Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, was not an official constitutional designation. It was an acclamation. The kind of organic recognition that political cultures produce when something genuinely extraordinary has happened, and the normal vocabulary of honour is not quite adequate to the scale of it. It was inscribed on coins. It was repeated in documents and inscriptions across the empire, and it captured something real. The man who walked through Rome in 274 had done what the previous 15 years of crisis and instability had made most observers believe was permanently impossible. The world had not been fully healed, but it had been restored to the condition in which healing was possible. For a city that had been living with the alternative, that was everything. The triumph of 274 was a culmination, but it was not a conclusion. The military reunification of the empire was the precondition for everything else Aurelian needed to accomplish. But it was only a precondition. An empire that was politically unified but economically broken, administratively hollowed out, and financially incapable of sustaining the frontier defence that kept the Germanic and Persian pressure at bay was not a restored empire. It was a temporarily stabilised one, vulnerable to the same cascade of failures that had produced the crisis in the first place. The moment the exceptional energy of an exceptional emperor was no longer available to compensate for structural weaknesses. Aurelian understood this with the same clarity that had allowed him to see the Palmyrene cataphract's vulnerability at Emesa. And the same 5 years that contained his military campaigns also contained a series of domestic reforms that addressed the structural foundations of the crisis rather than merely its military symptoms. These reforms are less dramatic than the campaigns, less cinematically compelling than the image of Roman cavalry turning on exhausted Palmyrene horsemen in the Syrian dust, and they have received proportionally less attention in the historical tradition, which has always preferred battles to monetary policy. But they were arguably as important to the long-term recovery of the empire as any victory Aurelian won in the field. The empire he was rebuilding needed more than unified borders. It needed a functioning economy, a reliable food supply, an administrative apparatus capable of governing rather than merely surviving, and a financial system honest enough to be trusted. He set about providing all of these simultaneously. with the same relentless operational tempo that characterized his military campaigns. The currency reform of 274 was the most ambitious monetary intervention in the history of the ancient Roman world, and it addressed a problem whose depth and complexity the numbers alone cannot fully convey. The denarius had been the backbone of Mediterranean commerce for 4 centuries. When it was sound, when the silver content it promised was the silver content it actually contained, it was not merely a medium of exchange but a guarantee. A statement by the Roman state that the economic relationships conducted through it rested on a foundation of institutional reliability. When emperor after emperor had debased it across the crisis decades, reducing its silver content from the high standards of the early imperial period to the 5% or less of the Gallic period, they had not merely reduced the purchasing power of the coin, they had damaged the institutional credibility of the Roman state itself as a guarantor of economic relationships. Every merchant who received a debased denarius and discovered that it was worth less than it claimed was receiving a lesson in Roman governmental untrustworthiness that no military victory could immediately reverse. Aurelian's reform introduced a new standardized coin, the nummus, with a guaranteed and marked silver content significantly higher than the degraded denarii it was intended to replace. The coins bore a stamp indicating their silver content, a quality guarantee that allowed users to identify and trust them in a way that the unstamped and variable denarii of the crisis period had never permitted. The reform also attacked the corruption within the mint system itself. Mint workers across the empire had been exploiting the debasement chaos to produce coins whose actual content fell below even the degraded official standard, extracting personal profit from a system already in disorder. Aurelian suppressed a significant mint workers' revolt in Rome. The sources suggest it cost considerable lives, and brought the imperial mint network under tighter central supervision that made quality control more consistent and fraud more dangerous to attempt. The expansion of the annona, the state system for distributing food to the urban population of Rome that had been a feature of Roman governance since the late Republic, was Aurelian's most visible welfare initiative, and it was simultaneously a political gesture, an administrative achievement, and a practical acknowledgement of how severely the crisis had disrupted the normal commercial mechanisms through which a city of nearly 1 million people fed itself. The traditional annona had provided subsidized or free grain distributions to the registered urban poor. Aurelian extended the system to include distributions of baked bread rather than raw grain, a significant logistical upgrade that required not just grain supply chains but bakery infrastructure operating at imperial scale, and added distributions of pork, olive oil, and wine. The expansion was not generosity for its own sake. The crisis decades had disrupted the long-distance trade networks that moved food commodities from the productive provinces to the consuming cities, and the monetary chaos had made price stability impossible in the commercial food markets. A population that could not reliably afford to eat was a population vulnerable to the kind of urban unrest that distracted emperors from the frontier problems they needed to concentrate on. The expanded annona was a stabilizing mechanism as much as a welfare measure, and organizing it required the restoration of the supply chain coordination across North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Egypt that the administrative disruptions of the preceding decades had allowed to deteriorate. The fact that Aurelian could restore and extend it was itself a demonstration that the imperial administrative machine was functioning again in ways it had not for a generation. The administrative and legal dimensions of his domestic program reflected the same practical intelligence. He applied to the civilian administration something of the same severity he applied to his troops. Corruption among officials was treated not as an occupational hazard to be managed within acceptable limits, but as a betrayal of function to be punished with the directness that the situation required. The reorganization of the craft guilds, the associations of workers in specific trades that were a fundamental feature of Roman urban economic life, under tighter imperial supervision served the double purpose of maintaining the supply of goods that the urban economy required, and of creating institutional channels through which military supply obligations could be efficiently managed. The senatorial class, which had lost its dominance over the military chain of command across the crisis, decades as professional soldiers replaced aristocratic officers, retained its administrative functions and its social prestige, and Aurelian worked with rather than against it on the domestic administrative agenda. Whatever his personal impatience with its cultural style, the relationship was tense but functional, each side recognizing what it needed from the other and maintaining the cooperation that both required. At the careful arm's length that characterizes productive partnerships between parties who respect each other's utility without particularly enjoying each other's company. The Rome that emerged from these reforms was not yet the Rome of the Antonine period, prosperous and confident and administratively effortless, but it was a Rome that was moving in a direction that the crisis years had made seem permanently unavailable. It was moving, slowly and with effort, toward recovery. The religious world of the 3rd century Roman Empire was one of the most extraordinary environments for spiritual experimentation and theological development that the ancient world ever produced. And it is almost impossible to understand Aurelian's promotion of Sol Invictus without first appreciating the extraordinary complexity and creative energy of that environment. The standard narrative of the period, paganism declining, Christianity rising, a clean transition from one to the other, is a retrospective simplification that flattens what was actually a tumultuous, unpredictable, and genuinely open contest among dozens of competing religious traditions, each offering its own account of the divine, its own community of practice, its own promise of meaning in a world that the crisis had made urgently in need of meaning. The traditional Roman religious system, with its hierarchical pantheon of state deities presided over by Jupiter and maintained by the official priestly colleges, had never been exclusively Roman in its content. Rome had been absorbing the gods of conquered and associated peoples since the Republic, incorporating Greek divinities through the process of interpretatio Romana, adopting Egyptian Isis and Osiris, welcoming the Anatolian Great Mother Cybele, and making room for a bewildering variety of local and regional cults alongside the official state religion. By the 3rd century, this syncretic accumulation had become so complex, so internally varied, and so lacking in any clear organizing principle that it functioned less as a coherent religious system than as an enormous and somewhat chaotic archive of divine possibilities, within which individuals and communities chose, according to personal inclination, cultural background, and the specific needs of their circumstances. Into this environment, several religious traditions were competing for adherence with a missionary energy that the traditional Roman state religion, which had never conceived of itself as a proselytizing movement, could not match. The cult of Isis, brought from Egypt along the same trade routes that moved grain and papyrus and luxury goods across the Mediterranean, had spread with remarkable speed and thoroughness across the Roman world, attracting followers with its rich mythology, its elaborate ritual life, and its promise of personal salvation through the goddess's compassion. The Mithraic mysteries, whose Roman form had developed from Persian religious traditions but had become something distinctly different from its origins, attracted substantial followings, particularly in the army. The grades of initiation, the communal meals, the emphasis on courage and loyalty had obvious appeal for soldiers in the specific conditions of 3rd century military life. The Syrian sun cults, carried west by soldiers and merchants and slaves from the eastern provinces, were proliferating in Rome and the western cities with a vitality that reflected the broader Eastern cultural influence on the Roman world. And Christianity, one of several Eastern mystery religions competing in this crowded market, was growing with a speed and organizational discipline that distinguished it from many of its rivals, building networks of mutual support across city boundaries, accumulating institutional resources, developing theological sophistication, and creating communities of practice whose care for their members generated a social reputation that translated into continued growth, even through the persecutions that periodically attempted to suppress them. Aurelian's response to this religious landscape was the promotion of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as the supreme divine patron of the empire and the emperor, and it was a choice of considerable theological and political sophistication for a man whose enemies sometimes characterized him as a blunt military instrument without much capacity for symbolic thinking. The solar deity he promoted was not a narrow sectarian choice. Sol Invictus was abstract and universal enough in its theological content to serve as a canopy under which many of the existing religious traditions could find accommodation. The sun was everywhere. The sun belonged to everyone. Every culture in the ancient world had some relationship to solar worship, and a supreme solar deity could present itself as the highest expression of what all those various traditions were reaching toward, rather than as a competitor requiring the abandonment of everything else. In 274, following his triumph, Aurelian dedicated a magnificent new temple to Sol Invictus on the Quirinal Hill in Rome. By ancient accounts, one of the most splendid religious structures in the city. Its precise character now difficult to reconstruct because its materials were absorbed into the medieval city in the thoroughgoing way that ancient Rome's building stock was routinely recycled. He established a new priestly college for the solar cult and elevated Sol Invictus to the highest position in the official divine hierarchy, placing the sun god's image on his coins in ways that made the imperial and divine authorities visually and symbolically continuous. The emperor who had restored the Roman world was doing so under the patronage and with the authority of the universal solar deity, a political theology that communicated something important about the nature of the authority being claimed, grounded not in the contingent success of military campaigns, but in the cosmic order that the sun represented and guaranteed. The long shadow that Aurelian's solar theology cast across the subsequent century is one of the most genuinely fascinating questions in late antique religious history, and it is a shadow whose outlines are visible, even if its precise contours cannot be definitively mapped. Constantine, who made Christianity the favoured religion of the Roman state in the early 4th century, grew up in a court where Sol Invictus was the dominant imperial religious language, and his early religious imagery drew on solar symbolism in ways that blurred the boundaries between the two traditions with a fluency that suggests genuine overlap rather than mere superficial borrowing. The date established for the celebration of Christ's birth, December the 25th, corresponds in the Julian calendar to the winter solstice festival of Sol Invictus, the moment when the unconquered sun begins its return after the year's darkest point, the victory of light over the maximum of darkness, the image of Christ as the light of the world, as the sun of righteousness, as the divine radiance dispelling the darkness of sin and death, runs through early Christian literature and iconography with a persistence and richness that connects to the solar theological vocabulary Aurelian had established as the dominant language of imperial religious expression. None of this means that Aurelian intended or anticipated Constantine's eventual religious settlement, or that Sol Invictus was merely a transitional placeholder waiting to be superseded. It means that the religious landscape Aurelian helped shape provided some of the symbolic vocabulary and institutional frameworks that later religious developments would draw upon and transform, which is precisely how religious history tends to operate, not through clean breaks and fresh starts, but through the gradual reconfiguration of existing elements into new patterns whose debt to what preceded them is real even when it goes unacknowledged. The campaign against Persia that Aurelian was preparing in 275 was the last great unfinished business of his reign, and in some ways the most revealing thing about what he intended to do with the empire he had rebuilt. The Sassanid Persian kingdom had been the most dangerous single external enemy the Roman state had faced since Hannibal, and the humiliation of Valerian's capture in 260 remained an unhealed wound in the Roman imperial self-image, a wound that every emperor since had lacked either the opportunity or the resources to address directly. Aurelian had spent 5 years dealing with the immediate structural crises that made any larger strategic ambition impossible. Now, with the empire reunified, the currency reformed, the frontier defence stabilised, and the administrative apparatus functioning again with something approaching its former coherence, the Persian problem was no longer merely one crisis among many. It was the remaining major threat to the empire's security and the remaining major insult to the empire's honour. And Aurelian was not a man who left either security threats or honour debts unaddressed when he had the means to address them. The army he was assembling for the Persian campaign was, by all accounts, the most formidable force he had yet commanded. The veterans of the Palmyrene and Gallic campaigns, supplemented by fresh recruitment, organised and supplied with the logistical thoroughness that had made all his previous campaigns succeed at the pace they had. The road to Persia ran through Thrace, and in Thrace, in September of 275, the road ended. The conspiracy that killed Aurelian was organised, according to the primary account preserved in the sources, around a freedman named Eros, who served as the emperor's secretary and managed his correspondence. The story the sources tell has the particular quality of 3rd century political violence. Intimate, petty in its immediate origin, catastrophic in its consequences. Eros, according to this account, had committed some offence that placed him on a list of men the emperor intended to have disciplined or executed. Facing this prospect, he forged a document that made it appear that a group of senior officers was also on the list, men who had no reason to expect punishment, but who, presented with what appeared to be documentary evidence that they were marked for death, made the calculation that they needed to act before Aurelian acted against them. The emperor, who had survived the Oithungi and the Alemanni and the Palmyrene cataphracts and the legions of the Gallic Empire, was killed in a conspiracy organised by a frightened secretary using a forged letter, surrounded by officers who believed a lie. Whether this account is accurate in its details, and the Historia Augusta's reliability on the specifics of imperial deaths is not always to be trusted, or whether it conceals a more straightforwardly political conspiracy organised by officers who had their own reasons for wanting the emperor gone, cannot be determined with certainty from what survives. What can be determined is that Aurelian died in Thrace in September of 275, and that the Persian campaign he had been preparing never happened, and that the Roman world was left to manage without him, the problems he had been on the road to solve. The aftermath of his death was remarkable in its own right, an episode that has no close parallel in the turbulent political history of the 3rd century, and that reveals something important about what Aurelian had meant to the institution he had served and saved. The army, apparently genuinely shocked by what it had done, or what had been done in its midst, did not immediately elevate another soldier emperor from its own ranks in the way that had been the reflex response to imperial death throughout the crisis period. Instead, in an exchange of letters that lasted several months, the army deferred the choice of emperor to the Senate in Rome, and the Senate, equally uncertain and unaccustomed to being asked, deferred it back to the army. The mutual deference went on long enough to become genuinely unusual. A pause in the brutal machinery of 3rd century political succession that reflected a collective hesitation about what came next and a recognition, perhaps, that the man who had just been killed was not easily or casually replaced. The Senate eventually elevated an elderly senator named Tacitus, a man of reputation and administrative experience, whose selection represented the Senate's attempt to reassert its traditional role in imperial succession that it had been losing for decades. Tacitus died within months, possibly of natural causes, possibly otherwise. His successor, Florianus, was killed by his own troops after a few months more, and then Probus, another capable Danubian soldier emperor in the clear mould of Aurelian, took the throne in 276 and began the work of continuing what his predecessor had left unfinished. Probus secured the Rhine frontier more thoroughly than any emperor since Marcus Aurelius. He settled large numbers of Germanic peoples within the frontier provinces as agricultural labourers and potential military recruits, a policy of controlled demographic incorporation that would become increasingly central to the late Roman military strategy. He maintained the administrative improvements Aurelian had introduced and extended the currency reform's stabilizing effects across a reign that lasted 6 years before he too was killed by his own troops in circumstances whose details suggest that the underlying political instability of the army had been managed but not eliminated by Aurelian's example. Through Probus, and then through Diocletian, who took power in 284 and built upon the foundations Aurelian and Probus had established the most thoroughgoing institutional reorganization of the Roman state since Augustus. And then through Constantine, who built upon Diocletian's foundations to produce the recognizable form of the late Roman Empire, with its Christian state church and its stabilized gold currency. Through all of these men and all of these decades, the thread of Aurelian's achievement ran as foundation rather than model, as the precondition that made everything subsequent possible, rather than the template that subsequent rulers consciously imitated. Diocletian understood what he was building on. Constantine inherited it without always acknowledging it. The deification the Senate voted Aurelian after his death. The formal honour the Roman tradition reserved for emperors whose memory deserved respect. Captured something. The political culture recognised, even when the political discourse did not always articulate it clearly, the man had been necessary. The world he left behind was better for his having been in it. In the brutal accounting of the 3rd century, that was an epitaph worth having. There is a particular kind of historical legacy that belongs to men who save things rather than build them, who prevent the collapse that would have made everything subsequent impossible, rather than constructing the monuments that subsequent generations point to as proof of greatness. These men tend to be honoured in their own time with a fervour proportional to the relief their contemporaries feel at having been saved, and then gradually displaced in the historical memory by the builders who came after them, who left more visible and more celebratory physical evidence of what the saved world was capable of producing once it had been given back the stability required for production. Aurelian belongs to this category of saviours, and his historical reputation has oscillated accordingly, effusively praised by the late antique writers who remembered the crisis and understood what its reversal had required. Somewhat overshadowed in later centuries by the more architecturally and institutionally spectacular achievements of Diocletian and Constantine, and restored to something approaching his appropriate stature by modern historians who have done the careful work of reconstructing what the 3rd century actually looked like from the inside and what it actually took to stop it. The scholarly consensus that has emerged from that work is generous and, on the evidence, justified. Aurelian was genuinely extraordinary. His 5-year reign represents one of the most remarkable demonstrations of individual will, military genius, and administrative intelligence in the entire history of ancient Rome, and the reunification of the empire was an achievement that shaped the subsequent trajectory of the Roman world in ways whose consequences extended for centuries beyond his death. The physical legacy he left in Rome is simultaneously the most visible and the most strangely invisible of any major emperor's contribution to the city. The walls are there. 12 miles of ancient brick running through modern Rome with the serene permanence of something built well enough to simply outlast the civilization that built it. They appear from the windows of trains approaching Termini station, rising unexpectedly from behind apartment buildings in the Pineto district, flanking the Via Appia Nuova near the Porta San Sebastiano, carrying within their brick courses the memory of 271 and the emergency that made them necessary. They are maintained today as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. Sections of them open to the public as a museum of the Roman defensive system, others still performing their ancient function as city boundary in the symbolic sense that the medieval city preserved and the modern city has never quite relinquished. The Roman brickwork that labourers laid under Aurelian's orders is still there, distinguishable by specialists from the modifications and heightening that later emperors added, doing more or less what it was built to do, which is simply to continue existing with the stubborn persistence of good construction applied to good materials by people who understood what they were making and why. The Temple of Sol Invictus is gone, its materials absorbed into the medieval city in the thoroughgoing way that Rome has always recycled its past. The precise location debated by archaeologists working from fragmentary textual references, and the ambiguous evidence of foundation traces beneath later buildings. The administrative records Aurelian reorganized, the mint reforms he instituted, the grain distribution systems he expanded. These leave traces in documents and coins rather than in standing structures, evidence for specialists rather than monuments for casual visitors. But the walls are there, and they are enough. The coins are there too, in museum cases across Europe and the Americas. Small bronze and silvered bronze discs stamped with the face of a man in military dress and the legend that makes the claim his reign earned. Restitutor orbis, restorer of the world. The numismatists who study them can read in their metal content the progress of the currency reform, tracking the implementation of Aurelian's monetary policy across the empire's mint network through the gradual replacement of debased denarii with the new standardized coinage bearing its silver guarantee. The reform marks stamped on the coins, the abbreviated indicators of silver content that allowed users to trust what they held, are documentary evidence of a governmental decision made in 273 or 274 by an emperor trying to rebuild the institutional credibility that the preceding decades had destroyed. Each coin is a small artifact of that effort, a physical object that passed through the hands of merchants and soldiers and farmers in the 3rd century Roman world, carrying its guarantee through a landscape that had not had reliable guarantees for a long time and was learning, slowly and with justified caution, to trust them again. The coins bearing Sol Invictus on their reverse, the radiate sun god whose image Aurelian promoted as the divine patron of his reign and his empire, connect directly to the solar imagery that Constantine would later adapt for his own religious program. A material thread linking the 3rd century religious reform to the 4th century Christian transformation through the shared vocabulary of divine light and imperial solar authority. The ruins of Palmyra are there, in the Syrian desert, damaged by the violence of recent years. Some of the most spectacular columns toppled by deliberate destruction, but not erased. The limestone is too massive, the construction too fundamental, for even determined demolition to remove entirely what the ancient Palmyrenes built at the height of their prosperity. What remains stands as testimony both to what the ancient world could create and to what Aurelian's punitive expedition ended when the city rose in revolt, and he responded with the completeness that the political logic of deterrence required. The great colonnade still rises from the desert floor in sections, the rose gold stone catching the light in the early morning and the late afternoon in colours that photographs approximate but cannot quite capture. The Temple of Bel still defines the eastern end of the ancient city plan. They are ruins of the world that preceded Aurelian, monuments to the greatness that Zenobia inherited and lost, and they carry within their weathered surfaces the full complexity of what the Eastern campaign meant, the military achievement and the cultural destruction, the strategic necessity and the irreplaceable loss, all present simultaneously in the same stone. History rarely allows clean accounts of great men's deeds, and Aurelian's story is no exception. The man who saved Rome also ended Palmyra. The man who was necessary rather than good gave the world he restored a chance it might otherwise never have had. The walls he built still stand. The empire he saved lasted another 2 centuries in the west and more than a millennium in the east. The Danubian soldier who took power at 55 and worked himself to the edge of human capacity before frightened men on a Thracian road stopped him had, in 5 extraordinary years, done what needed to be done. Rest easy.